Let's examine the power of a phrase.
Yes, the phrase is national emergency, and President Trump is talking about declaring one. He can invoke emergency powers, and he says he might do that to order construction of a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border. Here's the president describing the situation at the border on Sunday.
And we have an absolute crisis, and of criminals and gang members coming through. It is national security. It's a national emergency.
So do emergency powers let him order the construction of a wall?
Here to help us answer that question is NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley. Hi there, Scott.
Good morning, Steve.
Let's work through this. What are the president's emergency powers?
The president does have some power under the National Emergencies Act to shift money around, for example, from one Defense Department budget line to another.
Okay, so he can take existing money and move it into a different location. But then the question is, does the president alone get to decide when there is an emergency? Because you can look at 20 years of border crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border and find many, many years where crossings were much higher than they are now.
That's certainly going to be a question if the president were to try to invoke emergency powers in this instance. Just what is the nature of the emergency? Under this act, the president still has to consult with Congress. The idea is to give the president flexibility to act in the case of an actual emergency. It's not to cut Congress out of the budgeting process.
Oh, because this is not just shifting troops to a location or ordering some agency to do something unusual. This is actually spending money, which is Congress's prerogative.
That's right. And certainly if the president were to try to use this power in this instance, he would face legal challenges. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee has already suggested it would be an abuse of power. One question is, what military projects would the president stop funding in order to bankroll his border wall? And then, as I say, what exactly is the nature of the emergency? In that cut you heard from the weekend, the president was talking about crime and gang members. On Friday in his Rose Garden news conference, he actually raised the specter of terrorists. But the administration has really stretched its own credibility here. On Fox News over the weekend, Chris Wallace called out White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders over terrorism claims that just have no basis in fact. What we do have at the border is a surge in families from Central America presenting themselves, in most cases turning themselves in to Border Patrol agents. And because of U.S. law and court cases, it is difficult to deport those families or to detain them for an extended period of time. But that's a challenge that a wall would not really address.
Okay, so we have this challenge. We have the president's talk, at least, of a state of emergency, and it sounds like if he were to invoke that, it would have to be challenged in Congress, be challenged in court, and find out how that played out. This is all, however, sort of backdrop to negotiations to get funding for a border wall directly. That's what the president wants anyway, as part of negotiations with members of Congress to end a partial government shutdown. There were talks over the weekend. Are the two sides making any progress?
Not really. Even before Sunday's session led by the vice president, the president told reporters he didn't expect anything to come of it. So this really seemed more about giving the appearance of action rather than the reality of any effort to resolve things.
Scott, I ran into a federal worker over the holidays who said, well, I'm furloughed. There must be lots of people who are in that situation, other people who are working without pay. How will people beyond the federal government continue to feel the effects of this shutdown if it continues a while?
You know, Steve, this Friday is supposed to be payday for the federal government. That would be the first paycheck that those workers miss if it comes to that. If this goes on, we may begin to see tax refund checks delayed. Food stamps are okay this month, but not into February.
Scott, thanks for the update.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Scott Horsley. All right, the president is holding on to his border wall demand, but his administration is changing its approach to Syria.
That's right. President Trump says U.S. troops won't leave Syria until ISIS is, quote, gone. That is a change. Just before Christmas, the president said the mission against ISIS was over.
We have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
Okay, National Security Advisor John Bolton has added some conditions to that. He says around 2,000 U.S. troops will not come home until they're met. First, ISIS has to be gone. And second, Kurdish fighters, U.S. allies, have to be protected.
Karan Demirjian covers national security for the Washington Post, and she's in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
Is this really the policy now?
Well, this is the shifting policy as we're seeing it play out in real time. John Bolton is given the clearest assessment yet of what we will be doing to pull out of Syria, which will not be immediate. The president suggested when he made this statement last month that it would be happening right away. Now we know that it's getting scaled back. This is a sign that his advisors are having more influence over trying to pull him back from this policy, which really shocked everybody around him, allies and critics alike.
But this is why I want to be really clear about this. John Bolton is among the officials who stated a completely different policy shortly before President Trump announced his policy in December. Are we sure that what Bolton says this time is really what the president wants and will stick with?
It seems like what they're trying to do is not completely change what the president said he wanted to do, but explain it away and pirouette around what the president said we're getting out of Syria. If you talk to any of Trump's surrogates at this point and his allies, they won't say, oh, we're not getting out of Syria, the president was wrong. They'll say, well, he never said exactly how we were going to get out of Syria. So what we're doing is we're having a methodical conversation about how we'll do it. We're setting these conditions. The most clear contradiction is, of course, that one of the conditions that we'll wait until ISIS has been eradicated from the country is exactly what President Trump said had happened when he announced this policy. So it's clearly that his advisors are kind of pulling him back from the brink on this one. And the president does not seem to be outwardly refuting them at this point. So it's a sign of maybe there's some shifting going on, but it's definitely a contradiction.
Is it your sense, granting that things can change again, is it your sense that the policy has changed all the way back because now the United States is in Syria for some considerable amount of time until some difficult objectives are met?
It's unclear, right? At this point, we've seen reports that the period of time is lengthening. First, we were talking about a 30-day pullout. Then it was 4 months. Now there's no timeline associated with it at all. If that continues, then sure, we're talking about a reversal. But at this point, we don't know, right? Because the National Security Advisor has set out these conditions. This gives them some cover, so to speak, I suppose, for what happens going forward. But we don't actually know the details of what this plan is going to be or what types of agreements or, it was eradicating ISIS and making sure the Kurds were protected. It's not clear to the extent to which they need guarantees on that from others to say, okay, we're there, good. And that's been part of the problem.
Very briefly, how is the president's national security team changing and his advice changing? Because Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, Brett McGurk, special envoy to combat ISIS, and another top official have all resigned over this policy change.
Right. And there are concerns, especially around Capitol Hill, that the president will put a bunch of yes men in their place. But as of right now, you've got Shanahan still taking over from Mattis.
Patrick Shanahan, right.
Exactly, who was his deputy, and everybody kind of on hold because anybody who comes in that the president appoints will have to go through a confirmation process. But there's concern from Democrats that the adults have left the room, and right now the people around the president are trying to prove, well, that's not true.
Karen Demerjen, thanks very much for coming by.
Thank you.
She's with the Washington Post. Now the case of a Saudi teenager and her Twitter account that is capturing international attention.
That's right. This morning, there are tens of thousands of posts with the hashtag #SaveRahaf. They're talking about 18-year-old Rahaf Mohammed Al-Qanoun, who has spent the last day barricaded in a hotel room in Bangkok. She says her family is abusive, and she goes back to them. She's afraid she's going to be killed.
I'm not leaving my room until I see UNHCR. I want asylum.
That is from a video that she posted to Twitter yesterday. Now, this morning, authorities in Thailand are saying they won't deport her against her will, but activists are still watching this very closely.
Human Rights Watch now tells NPR that activists have filed an injunction to stop the Thai government from deporting her. Reporter Michael Sullivan is in Bangkok. He's following this story. He joins us by Skype. Hi there, Michael.
Hi, Steve.
How did she get away from her family in the first place?
Well, from what she told Human Rights Watch and a few others who spoke with her, she saw an opportunity and she took it, maybe even planned it in advance, that she was on a trip with her family to Kuwait, and Kuwait doesn't have the same rule about a woman traveling by herself, which is why she could get on a plane by herself, and she did. And that Bangkok was just a transit point, that her real destination was Australia and asylum there. But she didn't get the chance, Steve, because when she got off the plane here in Bangkok, she was met by a guy, it's unclear whether Saudi or Kuwaiti, who took her passport and later came back with Thai authorities, who then told her she'd be sent back to Kuwait this morning. She was supposed to leave on an 11 a.m. flight, but it took off without her after she barricaded herself in her room in the transit hotel at the airport, tweeting up a storm asking for help.
You're pointing out that if she had tried to leave from a Saudi Arabian airport, somebody might have said, wait a minute, you're a woman traveling alone. We frown on that. There might have been a problem. But in this case, she was outside the country. Now she's in Thailand. What kind of pressure is on Thailand to keep her from being sent back?
I don't think there's a lot of pressure on the Saudi government because of, there wasn't a lot after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, right? But on the Thai side, maybe a little different story. I think they're a little more sensitive to pressure, and several European governments have expressed their concern already. On the other hand, this kind of thing, Steve, happens often enough here in Thailand that human rights groups are really frustrated by it. In the past couple of years, Thailand has sent back Uyghurs and other dissidents to China when Beijing has asked. And just a few months ago, the Thais arrested a soccer player from Bahrain who'd been critical of a powerful government official. He'd already been granted asylum in Australia and had come here on his honeymoon, but he was arrested anyway. Here's Phil Robertson, the Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch.
I'm hoping that Thailand will recognize that if they proceed on the course that Saudi Arabia wants them to take, they will earn a very dark mark on their international reputation.
Okay, Michael, what is Thailand saying and what are the Saudis saying about this?
Basically, they both blame her. The Saudi embassy says they had nothing to do with it, that she was detained by the Thais because she didn't have a return ticket. That's a little confusing since she told Human Rights Watch she was just transiting in Bangkok. But it also seems that she may have told some news outlets that the guy who took her passport tricked her, telling her he could help her get a visa here, and she'd been planning on spending a couple of days here until she went on to Australia. Either way, the Thais were going along with the Saudi version of things till late this afternoon. Now they're saying she won't be returned against her will. Let's see.
Michael, thanks very much for the update.
You're welcome, Steve.
That's NPR's Michael Sullivan in Bangkok.
Any politician can give a speech. A few can be seen live on TV. But only the president can address the nation from the Oval Office, as President Trump will do tonight.
The tradition goes back to 1947, when most Americans did not yet have TVs. Harry Truman did it then about a food crisis in Europe. Richard Nixon, in turbulent times, spoke repeatedly from the Oval Office, including his resignation in 1974. Reagan spoke from his Oval Office desk. George W. Bush addressed the nation on 9/11. And tonight, the subject of President Trump's address is his demand that Congress budget money for a border wall. His demand triggered a partial government shutdown.
NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith joins us this morning. Hey, Tam.
Good morning.
So does giving an address from the Oval Office tonight mean President Trump has more or less leverage right now in these shutdown negotiations?
Well, President Trump has a problem, which is that some share of the American public, a large share of the American public, wanted him, even before the shutdown began, to make a compromise on the wall. And if he is going to get his wall funding, which seems like a mighty big if at this point, he has to convince the American public that there is a crisis along the southern border and that crisis can be solved by a wall. And thus far, the administration has had some difficulty connecting those dots and making that case. And so that is the case that President Trump has asked for 7 or 8 minutes of primetime TV to make.
I want to get to the facts of that in just a second. But first off, Democrats are agitating to have their say, though, right? If the president is going to speak from the Oval Office, Democrats want to be able to respond to his argument. Are they going to get that time?
It's not clear yet, but they're certainly asking for it. Here's a quote from a joint statement. Now that the television networks have decided to air the president's address, which, if his past statements are any indication, will be full of malice and misinformation, Democrats must immediately be given equal time. That was from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. If they were to get that time, I think we have a pretty good idea of what they might say. This is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer from over the weekend.
Democrats and some Republicans are asking President Trump not to hold hostage millions of innocent Americans.
And let's return, Tam, to the facts on the ground, because this is really what is complicating this whole issue. The president and his administration insist there is a crisis. You talk to lawmakers, sheriffs, mayors along the border, you get a very different picture. And even the numbers are in dispute. The administration keeps banning about this number, insisting thousands of known or suspected terrorists have come across the southern border. That's just not true. There's no evidence to that effect. The vast majority of those people are coming through airports, not across the border, right?
Yeah, that's right. And most of them are getting stopped in airports, some not even before they get to the United States, in fact. So we, in this briefing that was held yesterday with the vice president and the Homeland Security Secretary, reporters were asking, what's up with your numbers? You're giving numbers of thousands of people, potential terrorists, and they don't seem to wash with reality. And the Homeland Security Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen, said, well, you know, in terms of who's actually arrested at the border, that is classified information. We can't tell you that number, and it would come from the Department of Justice anyway. So they are not giving that number. But NBC News is reporting that it's only 6 in the last year.
Very different than a number of 4,000, as Sarah Sanders has repeatedly said. Meanwhile, the president says he wants to declare a state of emergency. If Congress doesn't give him the money, he's going to do that. Are we going to hear him talk about that tonight?
We don't know for sure, but we know that the White House is considering it, that lawyers are looking into it, and the president is seriously considering declaring a state of emergency. Whether that happens tonight or some other time isn't clear. The White House says they want that to be sort of last resort, and they'd rather have negotiations bear fruit.
NPR's Tamara Keith. Thanks so much, Tam.
You're welcome.
National Security Advisor John Bolton is on a trip. He is in Turkey trying to clarify when and how the U.S. will pull its troops out of Syria.
Bolton has said American troops will stay in Syria until ISIS is eradicated and until Turkey promises not to attack Kurdish fighters who have been U.S. allies. That comes weeks after President Trump promised to pull out from northern Syria very quickly, reportedly in as little as 30 days.
NPR's Ruth Sherlock was recently in northeastern Syria, where U.S. troops are, and she's tracked how U.S. allies there are watching all this unfold. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
So Steve just alluded to the kind of back and forth with all the statements on this. Can you walk us through what has transpired, what we've been hearing on this thus far?
Yeah, so President Trump said on December 19th that ISIS was defeated, and then to quote him, that the US troops are all coming back, and they're coming back now. But now military officials seem to have talked the president out of pulling out too quickly. They never agreed with his decision. And as you said, speaking in Israel, John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor, said, well, we are going to pull out, but only once ISIS is defeated, and not until the interests of our local allies, that's the Kurdish-led groups that have been fighting ISIS alongside the US, are protected. The president himself seems to have walked this back slightly. After initially declaring ISIS defeated, he now says that some US troops will remain at least until ISIS is gone.
And
so
I suppose we should note that
months or longer.
I suppose we should note, just to be complete, that both the president and John Bolton insist their position has not changed at all, although it would appear that it certainly has.
Right. You could say that this seems to be some kind of a face-saving measure whereby they're trying to stick with the idea that US troops will withdraw, but now the timeline of that is much less clear. And they're insisting that they need to protect these Kurdish allies.
So how do they do that, though, Ruth? I mean, how do they protect the Kurds if they're going to leave?
Well, that is the question. A lot of this depends on Turkey. Turkey considers these Kurdish militias that now rule this part of Syria as connected to militants in Turkey that it thinks are terrorists. And after President Trump's original announcement, they threatened to attack this part of Syria. John Bolton is in Turkey today to discuss all this and says that, the US won't leave until these Kurdish allies are protected. President Erdogan of Turkey is gunning to be able to take over these parts of Syria. He presented that in an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, saying, they could run the area through local allies on the ground. But, it's very, but that's something that, in a further plot twist, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says might actually be on the cards, and because President Trump and President Erdogan have talked about this. But this is, of course, something that the Kurds may never go for.
Right. I mean, I imagine the Kurds would take issue with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they see Turkey as a bigger threat than ISIS, and they've even been talking about potentially striking a deal with the Syrian regime if they have to strike a deal with somebody to be able to keep having some control of this area. And certainly, from speaking with Kurdish officials, it seems they would be much more interested in talking to the regime about this than Turkey.
NPR's Ruth Sherlock reporting this morning from Beirut. Hey, Ruth, thanks as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to focus in on Florida now because there's a big change taking place in that state today. As many as 1.4 million convicted felons are set to regain the right to vote. The measure comes from an amendment that was passed by 65% of Florida voters in November.
Election supervisors say that today they begin registering people who under the old law were barred from voting at all. Critics of this measure, including the governor-elect Rick DeSantis, say the state legislature must pass a bill that defines the terms of the amendment, which would delay implementation for a few months. So what happens next?
All right, let's ask NPR's Greg Allen, who's been following this story, joining us now from Florida. Hey, Greg.
Good morning.
So what is happening today? I mean, how many people are actually going to get registered to vote? Do we know?
Well, we'll see how many people show up. There's a lot of interest in this. This campaign's been going on for quite some time, and it definitely goes into effect today. Supervisors of election in Florida's 67 counties say they'll begin registering voters who are former felons who've served their time. If you have a felony conviction, you must have completed the sentence plus any probation and parole, and this doesn't apply to anyone who was convicted of murder or a felony sexual offense. But there are still lots of questions, though, about whether court costs and restitution judgments have been paid and who checks on that. Also, exactly which felony convictions still disqualify a person from voting. And these are all some of the reasons that the new governor, Ron DeSantis, says he believes the legislature will have to pass a measure to lay out some guidelines for all this. But that wouldn't be till March at the earliest when the legislature's back. But in the meantime, people will be registering to vote today.
I understand you've gotten to talk with some people who are going to get the right to vote again. What have they been telling you?
Well, I think this is such an important day for folks who worked. This is a law that's been on the books for 150 years. People have fought for years to overturn it. They finally were successful. As you say, 65% of the voters approved it. That's more people than voted for any candidate in the last election.
Wow.
So a very passed by a large margin. That's people in every community in Florida. And one of the people affected is Araida Guanipa, who's a former felon who worked for years on this issue. I spoke to her yesterday, and she said even she's nervous about it.
I talked to my husband. He said, you better wait until March. You better wait until what the governor say.
So there's still a lot of questions, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, the state election officials say they'll no longer are checking new voters against the felony database, so no one's unfairly disqualified. But when you fill out a form, you must affirm that you're eligible. So some are worried that signing a voter registration form mistakenly before the rules are clear could potentially be a criminal offense. Election supervisors say it's unlikely that anyone would be prosecuted in such a case, though.
I mean, Florida's a key swing state in the presidential election, where it seems it's never too early to talk about Florida and elections. Could this have any kind of impact in 2020?
Well, adding hundreds of thousands potentially new voters to the rolls is certainly likely to have an impact. Some of the organizers believe that will spur interest in a lot of new policies, maybe criminal justice reform, something that's kind of largely stalled in Florida up to now.
NPR's Greg Allen for us this morning. Greg, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
What, if anything, changed after President Trump and Democrats made their case on a border wall?
Well, we might find out today. Congressional leaders are going to be meeting with the president. Last night, the president asked the American people to reach out to them.
To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border.
The president blocked routine government spending measures unless they include money for a border wall. He raised the specter of drugs and crime. Afterwards, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer responded.
Much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear.
NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson was listening to the speeches and joins us this morning. Hi there, Mara.
Hi there.
So the president used the bully pulpit, as they say. Did you feel any sign of movement or change last night?
I didn't hear any sign of movement. There was nothing in the speech that offered a new compromise, no kind of legalize the dreamers in exchange for wall funding. That's a compromise that both sides flirted with a while ago. So I think unless congressional leaders and the president come up with something we didn't hear last night, today I don't think we'll make progress in these meetings because neither side is hurting enough politically yet.
Well, you said hurting enough. This is a war of attrition, isn't it? Each side is seeing who can suffer more. Were there any arguments the president laid out that would seem damaging to Democrats over the long term?
Well, I think the president had three goals last night. One is he needed to convince people outside of his hardcore base that shutting down the government to get funding for the wall is a good idea. And Democrats are pretty confident that that won't work. They say this was litigated in 2018. The president's message in the election was all about an invading caravan, and it didn't work. So they're pretty dug in. The second goal, of course, was to keep Republicans from abandoning ship and starting to vote with Democrats to reopen the government, something a small handful of Republicans have already done in the House, and about 3 Senate Republicans who are up in 2020 have been calling for. And the third goal, I think, was to show his base that he's fighting and to lay the groundwork for what might be the end game of this whole debate, which is declaring a national emergency on the border. Doing it himself, doing an end run around Congress.
Mara, is there some vulnerability for Democrats? Because there are a number of Democrats in Congress who, in past years, in other situations, have voted for funding for various kinds of fences and border barriers.
I think that's probably the strongest argument the president made in the last continuing resolution, government funding resolution he signed. The Democrats said you can spend this money explicitly. The language in the bill was you can spend this money on steel fencing, but you can't build a concrete wall. And he's saying now, fine, I'll build a steel fence. So, he's saying you approved this money for this kind of barrier in the past. Why don't you do it again?
Okay, thanks very much. That's NPR national political correspondent Mara Eliason. Now let's check some of the facts in the president's speech.
Yeah, and it's worth noting there was one notable omission in the speech. The president never said the word terror last night. This week, the White House has backed off claims about the number of terrorists crossing the border.
Yeah, there were questions about some numbers the White House was throwing around. NPR's Joel Rose covers immigration. Listen to what was there. Good morning, Joel.
Good morning, Steve.
And let's start with the president's dramatic language about people who are in the United States illegally committing crimes.
How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job?
Okay, there are dramatic cases. The president alluded to some of them, but are immigrants statistically more dangerous than anybody else, Joel?
No, immigrants are actually less likely than native-born people to commit crimes. But this is a technique that the president has used a lot, going back to his campaign, to point to individual anecdotes, sympathetic crime victims. For example, last night he talked about an incident, a police officer in California who was allegedly killed by an undocumented immigrant in December. The president also brought up MS-13, the violent street gang, which he does with some regularity. But by focusing on these gruesome examples, his critics say he is exaggerating the overall threat from immigrants and playing on fear. By the way, the police officer who was killed in California that the president called an American hero, also an immigrant from Fiji.
Well, the president also repeated a claim that he has made on Twitter. Let's listen to that.
Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl.
Okay, this does seem basically true, right? A lot of drugs do come north from Latin America.
Absolutely. But most of those drugs come through in cars and trucks that pass through legal ports of entry. So it's not actually clear that a border wall would do anything to slow them down or stop them.
So this is a version of the concern about people who come to the United States illegally also through legal ports of entry. They come with a visa and overstay the visa. The wall wouldn't affect them either.
And they are the largest share of people who are becoming undocumented immigrants. That's right.
Okay. Well, there's one other claim the president made that we want to check. Let's give a listen to this.
The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico.
Okay, this is vital, Joel Rose, because the president in his campaign didn't say we're going to build a wall and Congress and American taxpayers will pay for it. He said we're going to build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. Now he's saying this is how Mexico is going to pay for it through this trade agreement. Is there some provision in the new North American free trade deal to pay for wall construction?
Not directly, no. I mean, the president is talking about the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which was signed by the leaders of the three countries in November. Trump has repeatedly claimed that that new pact would usher in huge economic benefits for the U.S., essentially making up for the cost of the border wall. But there are two big problems with this argument. First, the agreement has yet to be approved by Congress, and that is not a sure thing. So any conclusions about how much money it's going to bring in are premature. And second, many economists say the new agreement is just a modest reworking of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that it is supposed to replace. They are skeptical that it's going to do much to really boost economic growth in the U.S.
And very briefly, the Democrats didn't speak very long. Were there any factual concerns in their short statements?
Well, one thing to note that I think you kind of hit on already with Mara, but the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has said that Democrats and the president both want stronger security. However, they disagree about the most effective way to do it. However, as the president did point out last night, congressional Democrats, including Schumer, have sometimes supported border barriers in the past.
Joel, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Joel Rose. All right, what are the consequences for R. Kelly after a documentary series focused on sexual abuse allegations?
Yeah, Lifetime says more than 2 million viewers have watched the Surviving R. Kelly series. It tells the stories of women who say the multi-platinum R&B artist abused them, isolated them, also had sex with them, some when they were underage. Accusers say Kelly ran a sex cult in Georgia and in Chicago. Kim Fox, the state's attorney in Cook County, Illinois, is now inviting other possible victims to tell their stories.
Please come forward. There's nothing that can be done to investigate these allegations without the cooperation of both victims and witnesses.
And we should say there's been a debate over why there wasn't more outcry and more investigation sooner. That debate is growing louder and louder on social media.
And NPR TV critic Eric Deggans has been listening. Hi there, Eric.
Hi.
What kinds of conversations are you seeing and hearing?
Well, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of attention being paid to this series. As you noted, 2 million people watched the debut, but over the course of this 6-part series, Lifetime is saying something like 18.8 million people have watched it. And that it's also their most talked about series on social media in the network's history, which gives you the sense that people are talking about it on social media. And the conversation we're seeing is this idea of, can you separate the artist from his music? There are fans out there who want to still enjoy sentimental hits like I Believe I Can Fly and Step in the Name of Love from R. Kelly. They're important in their personal history. But people are also pointing out, and the docuseries makes the argument, that he's used the wealth that he's amassed from these hits to build a strategy for grooming young women, for imprisoning young women, for abusing young women. And so people are arguing that you can't really separate those two things. And it's forcing a conversation about pedophilia, sexual abuse, and even believing black women when they speak out about abuse within black communities across the country, which seems to be the most impressive result.
Eric, is this case a little like Bill Cosby's case in that the allegations were sort of known for quite some time, but finally we've hit a moment where people are really paying attention?
I think that dynamic is definitely happening. I interviewed Dream Hampton, one of the executive producers on the series, and she told me that for some people, ideas like this don't really become concrete until they really see it on television. And there is something very striking about watching this docuseries and seeing woman after woman come forward. All of the women featured in the docuseries have made their allegations public before, but this is the first docuseries to bring them all together in one very potent story that covers from the beginning of R. Kelly's career in Chicago all the way up until the present day. And we're in this moment where we're seeing people look at the work of Louis C.K. and Kevin Spacey and Bill Cosby and go back and sort of say, you know, there were things that we heard about these guys that maybe we shrugged off or maybe we didn't pay enough attention to. And again, this idea of believing women when they step forward to tell stories of abuse. And I think in this Me Too moment that we're experiencing now, there's an effort to do that more. And so it's causing us to go back and relook at these incidents. And R. Kelly is the focus of this now.
What did you mean earlier, Eric, when you suggested that women of color might be treated differently as accusers than white women?
Well, Chance the Rapper, this famous musician, just did a video interview where he talked about that, where he talked about saying that working with R. Kelly was a mistake, and one of the reasons why he may have paid short shrift to some of the allegations about R. Kelly is because he didn't fully believe black women when they stepped forward. And I think a lot of people are having that conversation now thanks to this docuseries.
Wow. Eric, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Eric Deggans.